The cold metal walls of the Galactic Council's detention chamber thrummed with energy, faintly illuminated by the pulsing blue glow of containment fields. The air was sterile, thick with the scent of ozone and alien machinery. The single prisoner inside, a lone human, knelt on the floor, wrists bound by luminous shackles that pulsed with energy every few seconds. Each pulse sent a small but deliberate jolt through his nervous system, a reminder that his captors were in complete control. Or so they thought. He was dressed in the tattered remains of his tactical gear, the once pristine black combat suit now scorched and slashed from the battle that had led to his capture. Blood smeared across his chest, a mixture of his own and that of enemies who had underestimated him. His breathing was slow, deliberate, calculated. A heavy door slid open with a hiss. The prisoner didn't flinch. His head remained tilted downward, strands of dark, sweat-matted hair falling over his forehead. His expression was unreadable, a mask of quiet defiance. 2 guards entered first, hulking, reptilian creatures in shimmering exo-armor. Their eyes, slit-like and burning yellow, studied him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Behind them, a high-ranking officer of the Galactic Council strode forward, his crimson robes flowing behind him like liquid silk. He was tall, skeletal, with an elongated head and deep-set, glimmering black eyes that reflected no light. His species was known as a Sci-Fi, ruthless strategist, cold, methodical, and utterly without mercy. The Sci-Fi High Commander paused just a few feet away, folding his clawed hands behind his back. He let the silence hang between them for a moment before speaking. This, the commander began, his voice a series of layered, vibrating tones, is the infamous human warrior, the one they call a ghost on the battlefield. One of the guards sneered, baring jagged teeth. Doesn't look like much. Still, the prisoner didn't react. Not to their words, not to their presence. The High Commander stepped closer, lowering his gaze to study the man kneeling before him. "Name," he ordered. "Silence." A muscle twitched in the commander's jaw. He lifted one long, bony finger and gestured to a control panel. A guard immediately pressed a sequence of buttons. The prisoner's shackles flared, sending a powerful shockwave of energy through his body. The man's muscles tightened involuntarily. Pain arced through his limbs, burning its way up his spine like white-hot fire. But he made no sound. No grunt, no cry. Nothing. The guard pressed the panel again. Another, stronger shock. His jaw clenched. His fingers curled into fists. But his expression remained impassive. A third jolt, enough to make most beings scream. Yet the prisoner simply exhaled, slow and measured, as if it were nothing more than an inconvenience. The High Commander's gaze narrowed. "I will not ask again," he said coldly. "Your name." For the first time, the prisoner moved. His head lifted. Slowly, 2 ice-blue eyes, sharp as razors, locked onto the commander. The expression in them was not fear, not pain, not even defiance. It was something worse. Amusement. A slow smirk curved the man's lips. And then, finally, he spoke. Callsign Reaper. A hush fell over the chamber. A whisper, a shift in energy, so small, so brief that most wouldn't notice. But Reaper did. The moment his name left his lips, the room reacted. The guard stiffened. The technicians monitoring his vitals hesitated. And the High Commander, he didn't move at all. Not outwardly, but in his gaze, there was something new. Recognition and fear. The name spread like an infection through the ranks. The gathered officers, once smug in their victory, began exchanging uneasy glances. Some murmured in hushed tones. Others took a half-step back, instinctively distancing themselves from the man in chains. Reaper noticed. Good. The High Commander's expression remained unreadable, but the faintest flicker of tension ran through his skeletal features. "Reaper," he repeated, testing the weight of the name on his tongue. Another ripple of unease passed through the assembled officers. Reaper could feel it, the fear, the hesitation. It was subtle, creeping in like a shadow before the storm. These creatures, these so-called conquerors of worlds, had walked into this chamber certain of their superiority. Now, for the first time, doubt had taken root. The High Commander tilted his head slightly, his voice carefully measured. "I have heard of you." "I know," Reaper replied smoothly. "Silence." The High Commander's fingers twitched behind his back, almost imperceptibly. His black eyes locked onto the prisoner's face, searching for something, weakness, a crack in the mast. He found none. Reaper watched the alien carefully. He had seen this expression before, in the eyes of enemy commanders, in warlords who thought themselves untouchable. It was the expression of someone who had just realized they might be standing in front of something they could not control. The High Commander straightened, rolling his shoulders back in a display of authority. "You misunderstand the situation, human," he said coolly. "You are a prisoner of the Galactic Council. You have no power here." Reaper chuckled. Low, amused. The sound sent a chill through the room. "No," he said, voice quiet but laced with an unmistakable edge. "You misunderstand." A flicker of confusion crossed the High Commander's face. Reaper leaned forward slightly, his movements controlled, predatory. "I don't get captured," he said. "I let myself be taken." The words were a dagger, sinking deep. The High Commander's posture stiffened, and that's when Reaper saw it. The moment of realization, the faintest widening of the alien's gaze, the way his mandibles twitched involuntarily. Because now, the High Commander was asking himself the question that every enemy had asked before it was too late. If the Reaper is here, then what's coming next? The ship's lights flickered. A whisper of movement echoed through the halls beyond the chamber. Something was coming, and Reaper smiled. The silence in the chamber thickened, pressing down on the gathered officers like an invisible force. The name, Reaper, still hung in the air, its weight suffocating. No one spoke. No one moved. The High Commander's mandibles clicked softly, a subconscious display of unease. The authority he had projected mere moments ago now felt fragile, delicate, like glass stretched too thin. He had studied human warfare. He had reviewed their tactical doctrines, their primitive but effective combat methods. He had laughed at their arrogance, their belief that they could hold their own against the Galactic Council's superior might. But the Reaper was different. The stories whispered through the ranks of the Council's military weren't mere human propaganda. They were warnings, hushed words exchanged in dark corridors where soldiers thought no one could hear. Reaper was more than a soldier. He was a myth, a shadow, a walking death sentence. The Council had lost entire battalions to an unseen force, ships breached from the inside with no alarms triggered, outposts wiped clean as though death itself had passed through. And the reports, those few survivors who had lived just long enough to be debriefed, spoke of the same thing. A ghost in black armor, an unstoppable specter. The Reaper. The High Commander took a slow step back, his claws twitching at his sides. "Impossible," he murmured, though the certainty in his voice was gone. "You were captured. We have you restrained." Reaper tilted his head slightly, ice-blue eyes locked onto the Commander's. "Do you?" It wasn't a question. The High Commander felt his twin hearts quicken, an unfamiliar sensation crawling down his spine. He turned sharply to his nearest officer, a Sci-Fi lieutenant with dark gray scales. "Double the containment field." The lieutenant hesitated. That hesitation lasted only half a second, but it was long enough for the High Commander to notice. Doubt. That was Reaper's real weapon. Still, the lieutenant obeyed, tapping rapidly on a holographic interface. The energy cuffs around Reaper's wrist flared, brightening, their hum intensifying. The force field surrounding him thickened, the flickering blue glow turning almost opaque. Reaper flexed his fingers, as if testing the restraints. The light pulsed harder, the energy barrier reacting. But something was wrong. The monitors lining the walls, tracking his vital signs, his neural activity, they all began to flicker. One by one, their readings distorted, numbers glitched, symbols twisted into nonsense. The High Commander's gaze snapped to the displays. "What is this?" A technician's claws danced over the controls. "Sir, there's an interference. The containment field is at full power." But he hesitated, voice trembling. "It's reacting to him." The High Commander turned back to Reaper, still kneeling, still bound, still smiling. The commander's throat tightened. He gestured to the guards. "Move him. Now." The guards hesitated. These were elite warriors, trained to follow orders without question. But the atmosphere had changed. The room no longer felt like a place of power. It felt like a trap. And Reaper wasn't the one caught in it. The first guard stepped forward, hesitantly reaching for Reaper's shoulder. The moment his clawed hand made contact, the lights went out. Total darkness swallowed the chamber. Then, a single, rhythmic click-click-click echoed through the room. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't from the ship's systems. It was deliberate. Knuckles cracking. A whisper of movement. Then, snap! A guttural scream tore through the air. The emergency lights flashed back on, flickering wildly. For a brief second, the High Commander could see. The guard who had reached for Reaper was on the ground, his arm bent at an impossible angle, his breathing ragged with pain. And Reaper was standing. No shackles, no restraints. Free. The room erupted. Guards raised weapons, but Reaper was faster. His hand shot forward, seizing a second guard by the throat, lifting him clean off the ground. The reptilian soldier thrashed, clawing at Reaper's wrist. But the grip was unbreakable. A sickening crunch. The guard's body crumpled to the floor. Reaper turned, movements fluid, unbothered. The High Commander could barely process what he was seeing. "Shoot him," he roared. The remaining guards obeyed, raising their plasma rifles and opening fire. The chamber exploded in chaos. Bolts of green energy streaked across the room, illuminating the darkness. But Reaper was already gone. A shadow in motion. He weaved between the shots, impossibly fast. Too fast. One of the guards barely had time to react before Reaper was in front of him. A single strike, a precise, brutal blow to the throat. The alien gurgled, staggering back before collapsing. The others hesitated. That was their mistake. Reaper capitalized, twisting into a low sweep that took another soldier's legs out from under him. Before the downed alien could even hit the ground, Reaper was on him, snapping his neck with a sharp jerk. One by one, they fell. The High Commander could not breathe. This wasn't war. This wasn't battle. This was execution. And Reaper moved like he had done this 1,000 times before. He had. In less than 30 seconds, the chamber was littered with bodies. The High Commander stood frozen, his mind reeling. He barely registered that his own claws were trembling. Reaper turned to him at last, those terrible blue eyes locking onto his. For the first time in his long and decorated career, the High Commander felt prey. "You should have left me alone," Reaper said softly. The lights flickered again. Then the alarms began, loud, shrieking wails echoing down the corridors. Reinforcements. Too late. Reaper tapped the comm unit on his wrist. Phase 1 complete. Static. Then a voice on the other end. Calm. Professional. Copy that. Package secured. Reaper glanced at the High Commander, the last one left standing. Almost. The comm cut out. Reaper took a slow step forward, the High Commander stumbling back. The last thing the alien heard before everything turned to darkness was Reaper's final whisper. "Your war is over." The alarm screamed through the Galactic Council's warship, their shrill, pulsing wail vibrating through the metal walls. Emergency lights flashed red, casting jagged shadows over the bodies strewn across the detention chamber floor. The High Commander stood alone now, his twin hearts pounding. His elite guards, his best warriors, lay crumpled in grotesque angles, their weapons scattered beside them. It had taken less than a minute. And now, the Reaper turned his attention to him. The High Commander had been in battle before. He had orchestrated planetary invasions, led fleets that crushed resistance with precision and power. He had broken entire civilizations under his command. But he had never been hunted, never faced something like this. Reaper moved with deliberate calm, stepping over the fallen bodies without a care, like death itself walking among the remains of its handiwork. His blue eyes locked onto the commander, void of emotion. This was no soldier. This was an executioner. The High Commander forced himself to straighten, swallowing the fear rising in his throat. "You think this will change anything?" he spat, reaching for his wrist communicator. "Reinforcements are already on their way." Reaper didn't react, not even a flicker of concern. A heartbeat later, the High Commander's communicator crackled to life. A garbled, frantic voice filled the chamber. "This is Bridge Command. We are under attack. Unknown forces disabling our systems." A sudden, guttural scream cut off the transmission. Static, then silence. The High Commander's breath hitched. His claws twitched at his sides. He tapped the communicator again. "Bridge, respond." Nothing. His gaze snapped back to Reaper, horror twisting in his gut. "What did you do?" Reaper exhaled, slow and measured. "You really don't get it, do you?" A shudder ran through the ship, a deep, almost imperceptible vibration in the metal. It wasn't an explosion, not an impact. It was something worse. A presence. Something was already inside the ship. Not an army, not a fleet waiting outside. Something else. The High Commander's mind raced. "Impossible," he whispered, though he no longer believed it. "Our security is impenetrable. You couldn't have." "I didn't need to," Reaper interrupted, stepping closer. The flickering red lights cast sharp shadows across his face. "I just needed you to take me in." The High Commander's stomach twisted. It hit him all at once. This wasn't an escape attempt. This had never been about escaping. Reaper wanted to be here. He let himself be captured. The ship lurched, not from an external force, no explosion, no impact. It was internal. The lights dimmed, systems failing one by one. The hum of the engines wavered, the steady drone that had existed since the ship's creation choking like a dying breath. And then the whisper started, faint, almost imperceptible at first. Not words, not in any language the High Commander could recognize, but they were there, skittering through the walls, echoing through the vents, crawling beneath the floor. The High Commander's eyes darted wildly, his claws flexed. "What is this?" Reaper finally stopped, standing just a few feet away. "Welcome to the real war." A deep boom reverberated through the corridors outside. Not an explosion. Something else. Something breaking through. The whispers grew louder. The High Commander's vision blurred for a fraction of a second. He shook his head, trying to focus. His equilibrium felt off. A strange pressure built in his skull, like something was pressing against his thoughts. Panic clawed at his chest. He took a step back. This is some kind of illusion. A trick. Reaper's expression didn't change. "Tell yourself that if it helps." Another boom. The chamber's main doors buckled. Not from an external attack. Not from explosions or forced entry. Something was pressing against them from the inside. The metal warped, pulsing like living tissue. The whispers had become a chorus. The High Commander's mind reeled. "This ship is equipped with planetary-class defenses. Whatever you brought here won't survive our countermeasures." Reaper tilted his head. "Countermeasures." He let out a quiet breath of amusement. "You still don't understand." The ship screamed. Not the alarms. Not the systems. The metal. The walls themselves. The vessel was alive, and it was in pain. The High Commander's blood ran cold. He turned to flee, to run for the emergency transport bay. The door behind him burst open, and the void stepped in. Not space, not a breach in the hull, Something else. A darkness deeper than black, shifting, writhing, seething as it poured into the chamber like ink spilling from an unseen wound. And from that darkness, shapes began to emerge. Not creatures, not machines, something in between. They slithered, unfolded, their forms impossible to fully comprehend. Limbs that weren't limbs, eyes that weren't eyes, things that had no right to exist in this reality, but had forced their way in anyway. The High Commander's breath came in sharp gasps. He felt them before they even touched him, a pressure in his mind, a pulling, like something trying to peel him apart from the inside. The creatures didn't move toward Reaper. They didn't even see him, because they were never meant to harm him. They were here for the Council, for the High Commander, for everyone on this ship. Reaper finally spoke, his voice calm, almost indifferent. You wanted a war. The High Commander barely heard him over the sound of the walls groaning, the ship buckling, his own mind fracturing. Well, Reaper murmured, here it is. The darkness swallowed everything, and the screams of the Galactic Council warship echoed into the abyss. The ship was dying, not in the way a vessel is destroyed by battle. No fire, no explosions, no metal torn apart by missiles or plasma rounds. It was rotting from the inside. The walls no longer felt like walls. The floors, the corridors, they pulsed, warped, and twisted like muscle and sinew beneath an unseen force. The High Commander staggered backward, his twin hearts hammering in his chest, his breathing ragged. The whispers were everywhere now, no longer distant, no longer vague. They spoke to him. They knew him. You have taken. You have conquered. You have slaughtered. The words slithered into his mind, coiling around his thoughts like a noose. Now it is your turn. He clutched his head, his claws digging into his own temples. But the voices did not stop. They were inside him, tearing through his memories. Images flashed before his eyes. Planets he had ordered burned to ash. Colonies reduced to nothing more than whispers on the galactic wind. Families, entire civilizations, crushed beneath the might of the Council's rule. He had justified it all. War was power. Control was survival. But now, he understood. He had never been the predator. The Galactic Council had never been in control. They had been allowed to rule. And now, something ancient, something worse, had come to take it back. He turned to Reaper, his vision shaking, the lights above flickering wildly. You think this thing will serve you? He choked out. Reaper stood in the center of the carnage, completely still. The flickering red light painted his armor in streaks of blood and shadow, his face unreadable. I don't need it to serve me. His voice was calm, measured. I just needed it to see you. The High Commander's stomach twisted. Realization hit him like a blade to the gut. This wasn't about a mission. This wasn't about Reaper's escape. This wasn't even about war. This was judgment. The whispering grew louder, taking on shape, forming into something physical. The shadows that had poured into the chamber, the darkness that had moved like liquid night, it began to rise. They had no true form, no singular shape. They shifted as they walked, folding in and out of reality, moving like something that was never meant to be seen. The ship groaned beneath them, the very metal bowing to their presence. And for the first time in his life, the High Commander prayed, not to a god, not to anything he had ever believed in before. He prayed to be spared. Please, he whispered, his voice cracking. Reaper watched him with something almost like pity. You never spared anyone, he said softly. The High Commander dropped to his knees. I didn't know. Reaper's expression was unreadable. And now you do. The shadows moved closer, reaching. The High Commander screamed. Bridge Command, 5 minutes earlier. Lieutenant Drax of the Galactic Council fleet had seen many things in his career, but nothing like this. The bridge was in complete chaos. Warning lights flashed across every console. Every alarm shrieked at full volume. and the once orderly crew was falling apart. Weapons were offline. Shields were down. Even the ship's internal atmosphere was shifting, the air growing thick, heavy. "Wrong! Commander," an officer shrieked. "We've lost contact with engineering. Navigation is unresponsive." Another called. Drax gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay calm. "Get me a read on." The lights flickered. Every screen, every console, every interface cut out at once. A single symbol replaced all of them. Not text, not a warning code, just an eye, deep, black, watching. Drax felt his throat tighten. What is this?" A voice came from the ship speakers. Cold, unfamiliar. "Wrong. You are seen." The bridge plunged into darkness, and the screaming began. The final moments. The High Commander lay on the floor of the detention chamber, eyes wide, mouth open, his mind shattered. The things that had come for him had no need for violence. They had unmade him. He was still breathing. His body was still intact. But he was gone. Reaper watched, his expression as cold as ever. The warship around him was falling apart. Not from battle, not from damage, but because it no longer belonged to the Galactic Council. Reaper tapped his wrist communicator. A single voice responded. "Extraction inbound. ETA 30 seconds. Reaper turned, walking past the High Commander's hollow shell of a body, past the writhing shadows, past the corpses of guards who had died not knowing what they were truly fighting. By the time he reached the ship's hangar, the evacuation ship was already docking. The Council's fleet, once mighty, once feared, was silent. Its systems dead, its crew gone, and in the darkness, something else had taken its place. Reaper stepped onto the extraction vessel. The pilot turned, eyes wide. "Sir, what happened?" Reaper didn't answer at first. He just looked back, one last time, at the dying warship, a graveyard floating in the void. Then he simply said, "Balance." The ship left. Behind them, the Galactic Council's flagship, one of the most powerful war vessels in existence, vanished. Not destroyed, not broken apart, just gone, as if it had never been there at all. Epilogue: the Galactic Council never received a distress call. No emergency transmissions. No black box records. To them, the warship had simply disappeared, an entire vessel, along with its crew, its commanders, its secrets. Their enemies had no explanation. No one took credit. But in the shadows of the galaxy, whispers began to spread about a force that did not obey the rules of war, about an executioner who walked among monsters, and about the legend that would never die. The Reaper had come, and he would come again.